Alright, in this video we're going to go ahead and start putting together a configuration utility for our Unity client. So we're going to have a variety of different environments that a client can live in, and we're going to need different configuration options for each of them. I decided to sort of tackle this whole thing right now instead of just continuing on building out the application and hard coding configuration options as we move along, so that we don't run into the situation where we have a bunch of hard coded configuration options within our client. We've already run into a situation where we need a configuration option that will change between development, particularly between development between developers as well, and in our quote production unquote environment. So what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to put together a really basic sort of system that allows us to define configuration options using JSON and then allow us to override them by merging other JSON files. So the idea will be is we'll have a base configuration file, and then we'll have overrides on that file for the different environments that we might be in. We'll have a special file, a dev file, that'll be specific to the developer that's working on the application at the moment. What I mean by that is we won't check that file into source control so that each developer who downloads this project can choose different configuration options for that. I know that we haven't quite done that yet for our other projects. We've committed our web.configs, for example, which constitute the developer configuration. We've committed these to source control. It's not the most ideal way to do this, unfortunately, but so far we haven't had a very convincing reason to break this out into local development configuration files. In the future we could go ahead and do that as well, although it'll take a little bit of extra work. But since we're putting together a configuration system, I do want to build up the ability to do this from the start, to have a local development configuration file on a per developer basis, as well as a base configuration file for things that won't change between environments, and then as well as a production configuration file. Now the production configuration file we will be committing to source control, just like what we do with our web.configs. Again, not the most ideal thing. There's a lot of people who say that's terrible practice. In this particular case, I don't really care too much about committing those configuration options either into source control. If we were to not commit things like our web.configs, or actually we don't even put a different connection string in here. Huh. Well, either way. The point is, though, is you would normally put them on your continuous integration server, at least the server that's responsible for deployment. But anyway, this will be a pretty interesting little component. I do want to sort of design and develop it all here on video. I don't know how far we'll be able to get along with this particular component in this video, but I did want to just show an example of how I would go ahead building out and fleshing out a new component for the system on screen, just to show you guys some of the processes that I'll go through. However, that will mean that there might be some backtracking and so on and so on. But fortunately, I don't believe this is going to be a particularly large component, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Basically, when we want to start putting together a component, the first thing we need to do is figure out what that component should do. So the way that I've kind of came up with putting this together is we will have a configuration file that's located in our BuzzMMO client Unity project that will serve as our base configuration file. Then we'll have another file for production and another file for development. The way I want to do this is have these files be merged together. Now, they may be merged together during runtime, or they may be merged together at compile time. And the reason I want to do it like that is, like I said in the previous video, I don't want these configuration files all to exist on the Unity build. I don't want a person to be able to decompile the Unity build and get configuration options for different environments that it wasn't built for. That being said, when we're in the editor, we'll run into a very difficult situation where we can't actually write code that'll go out and perform that compilation of the config files, i.e. the merging of the config files between the base and the development. because there's nothing really to hook into at that point with Unity to actually put together that file. Actually, I think there is, but it would have to be run anyway every time we hit play. So what I'm wanting to do is, if we're in the Unity editor, I want it to sort of merge these files together in memory and then use those configuration options while we're playing the game in the editor. Then in production, the way I want that to work is I want to build a custom build step that performs the merging of the base and the production configuration, and then spits it out into a file that will then be included in the Unity build, meaning these configuration options will be compiled into the actual Unity build and not exist as a separate file. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get started, I guess. The first thing we need to do is, I guess we can start with building some tests out and getting an idea of what we want to name the component and what we want it to do, or at least what the methods should look like. And this is pretty much where I typically will start off when putting together a new component. So the first thing is it will be in our base project. It'll be in our base infrastructure namespace because it needs to be shared between the client and the build, and potentially it could also be shared with the server in the end. And so we need to figure out a name for it, because I want to name the test fixture the same as the component. So I don't know really what to call it. I don't want to call it configuration because there's a class called configuration inside of .NET, and I don't want to get it in conflicts. We could call it game configuration, but I don't want to specifically tie this to the project or to the game project itself. Again, this component could be used in a variety of different circumstances, and I want to make it general enough to encourage its use outside of just being used for the client. We could call it merged configuration, configuration values, configuration store, configuration registry. See, the problem is it's either too specific or too generic. Naming things is hard. Remember, there's three things, or the three most difficult things in computer science are naming things and off by one errors. But, I don't know. Something like that. Let's see. I think I'm just going to call it configuration store. So let's create a class, and let's call this configuration store tests. And we're going to annotate this class as a test fixture, which of course will bring in nunit.framework. And the first thing I want to do is I want to write a basic test that will allow us to, I don't know, dump some JSON into it, and then read the JSON values back out. That's going to be the first test. The first test is we need to stuff some JSON into it, make sure it works, and make sure we can pull the values back out. The great thing about this test is it'll show us how to put data into it and how to extract data out of it. At least it'll give us an idea of what we want that API to look like. So we're going to go ahead and make a test, and I'm going to say public void can parse and extract JSON data. Okay, so how is the usage of this component going to look like? Again, this component doesn't exist yet. So we have complete creative freedom over how we want to put this together. So what I want to do is we'll start with instantiating an object. Seems like a straightforward thing to do. And we're going to call it configuration store. And it's going to be a new instantiation of configuration store. So on configuration store, we're basically right now looking at defining how we want two operations to work. One, we want to be able to stuff JSON into it, and two, we want to be able to extract data back. Now, extracting data back, I believe, needs to be done in a strongly typed fashion. So, let's see here. This is going to get complicated now that you actually think about how we can handle the merging of things like objects and arrays. I'm thinking that merging... Let's see here. Alright, configuration store, let's do something like we want to be able to dump JSON into it. So let's say load JSON. Maybe not load JSON, maybe merge JSON. Maybe the way that we'll define this method will be used for A, stuffing the base configuration data into it, and then B, it'll also be used to merge additional data into it. It'll allow us to overwrite particular properties. So we'll say merge JSON, and we're going to require, so we're going to pass in a string, that's a JSON string. We're going to require that it's an object. That'll be a requirement that we'll put into merge JSON. And we'll just say value1 colon string string value. And let's go ahead and do value2, and let's do 1, 2, 3, 4 as that data. So we have two configuration options, one's a string and one's a number. So how do we extract data out of this? So I want to say configuration store, and the way I want to extract data out of this is going to be interesting because I do want to have the ability to do nested objects. In fact, I wonder if we can get away with doing something like using JSON.NET. I'm wondering if we could do something like configuration store dot, or we could just do something like, we could just expose JObjects directly and do something like this. So value string should be string value. And then we'll say configuration store at value2 dot value int should be 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is our basic test. So it's interesting that we've kind of, or I've kind of come up with a basic API. And what I'm thinking actually is that we should actually just return JObjects directly from JSON.NET, and that'll make things a lot easier for us. However, that really boils down to, is it even possible to do merging with JSON.NET? And well, I guess we'll find that out shortly. So that's what we have right there. I guess we can go ahead and write another test right here too, because it'll use the exact same public API. So we'll say public void can merge JSON object, and we'll say var configuration store equals new configuration store, and then we'll say configuration store dot merge JSON. We'll pass in value1 string value, value2 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll let's say we want to override value2. So how do we do that? I'll say merge JSON, passing in a object of value2 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we'll say configuration store at value1 dot value string should be string value, making sure that we didn't override the existing one. And we'll say configuration store value2 dot value parsed to int should be 5, 6, 7, 8. So this test will allow us to identify if our things are being merged properly. Now things get a lot more confusing once we start wondering how we're going to put together objects. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me go ahead and let's write another test, because I want to demonstrate something that I really want to put together with this implementation of configuration store, something that I think will make it very useful. So let's write a couple more tests that are a little bit more complex. So let's say can parse and extract JSON object. So we'll start with configuration store equals new configuration store. Again, I'm just writing this all off the top of my head, so I'm not typing that quickly right now. Merge JSON, we'll pass in obj1 will be an object, and he'll have a value1 of 1, 2, 3, 4, and a value2 of string value. Actually, just to make this consistent with the other tests, I'm just going to go ahead and do value1 is the string value and value2 is the int value, just for some consistency. Now the question is how can we with the API that we're developing right now? Again, the purpose of this exercise right here is to get a feel for how this class should work and how we should be able to work with it. So basically what I'm thinking here is, if I were a consumer of this class, what would be the best syntax that I can use to acquire or extract, let's say, value1 or value2 out of the configuration store? So let's think here. So I want to keep this indexer in place right here. I think that's really cool. So we'll say obj1, but when we get obj1 back, how do we want to be able to access it? Well, we could say something like, well, let's do obj1.value1. You know, that would actually be really cool to do. The problem is that it would actually put in a bit of additional work for us to make that happen. I'm not sure, because remember, JObjects that I think we're going to be returning, the JSON.NET objects, they actually have an API for extracting values out of them. So what I want to do here actually is I'm just going to write some code just so I can get autocomplete and I can get a better idea of the JObject syntax. So I'm going to say JObject equals new JObject. And this is going to require that I reference newtonsoft.json. So what I'm going to do here, because we'll need to do this anyway in order to use the configuration store, we'll need a reference to newtonsoft.json. I will go ahead and in our Buzz MMO tests project, I'll go to references, manage NuGet packages, and then I will go ahead and include json.net, which happens to be the second most downloaded package on NuGet. So let's go ahead and get that installed and wait a year and a half. Close that out. I don't need a introduction to... Actually, I'm just going to take this. I'm going to copy that and bring it off screen just in case we need to reference this documentation later. And now that I've done that, I can now instantiate a new JObject. Of course, I do need to import Newtonsoft JSON link. So, JObject, what kind of API do we have here? Like, let's say... So we have this value thing, which is cool, which I've already been using because I know of it. Let's see. How could we get value1 out of obj1? If looking right here, if I did JObject at value1 dot value string, that should actually give it to me. So let's go with that syntax. I think that'll work. So I'll do object1 and then value1 and then value string should be string value. I think this is actually a perfectly acceptable syntax for acquiring nested objects out of it. And the great thing about using JObjects in our public API is that it really allows us to take advantage of the JObject feature set of being able to convert objects to other objects. And I think that's really important to expose that functionality without a whole lot of additional work. Of course, that does tie our configuration store to the implementation of JSON.NET. I'm not too concerned about that because JSON.NET is ubiquitous across the .NET landscape. So configuration store obj1, and then we'll do at value2 dot value int should be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the next test I want to do, this is going to be really interesting, this particular test. I want to do can merge JSON or nested JSON object. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we have a base configuration value or a base configuration. So I can't talk and type at the same time for some reason. Let's say we have the same a base configuration that has a nested object in it, and we want to override one of the values in that nested object. How would that syntax? What would that syntax look like? Well, let's go ahead and say merge JSON, and do obj1 value1 is a string of value, and then value2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll close off both that to make it valid. So how would I, for example, I want to change the value of value2 to something else? What would that override file be? Well, I guess it would just be obj1, and then we would have an obj1 with just one value in it, value2. And then it would look like that. So now we should be able to say configuration store at obj1 value1 dot value string should be string value. And then, of course, we're going to need the configuration store at obj1 at value2 dot value int should be, and it should be 5, 6, 7, 8, but I messed up right there. This should be 5, 6, 7, 8 on the second merge. Okay, so this actually starts to bring in some levels of complexity. For example, let's say we wanted to, well, we don't really care about that. I think the biggest complexity with what I'm doing here isn't with merging objects. I think it's with merging arrays. Like, how would we be able to merge arrays if we wanted to, for example, remove all the values of an array and just add new values into it and so on? I'm wanting to kind of defer that to a later version because I want this to be as straightforward and simple to implement as possible, yet still give us all the features we need to do what we want to do. So I think I mostly just want to ignore arrays for now. And once we actually get to working with arrays, we can introduce additional syntax into our override JSON files to say something like, well, we want to merge an array or we want to replace an array is basically the two options there. For objects, I don't really care. I mean, objects should be able to add additional values or they should be able to replace old values. In the case what we have right here, where our second configuration file is going to replace the value 2 on the base configuration, but keep the value 1 the same. That's pretty much 99.9% of what we'll ever need to do with this. So we can just sort of keep it simple. Don't worry about merging arrays. Don't worry about being able to remove attributes from existing objects. But this whole discussion also brings in another potential edge case, and that is going to be, how do we handle the case of adding a new value into the configuration store? And I honestly don't really care about that. In fact, I don't even necessarily want to allow a nested configuration file or a configuration file override to add new keys into objects in the base configuration file, because I think that there's no value in doing that, because our code is going to have to reference known values and known keys, and so in that case, I'm not even going to bother writing a test for it. I'm just going to leave that behavior undefined, and I'm not going to worry about even testing it, because right now what you're looking at is basically 99.9% of all we're going to need for this, except for the ability to dump a JSON file. And that's going to be pretty straightforward to do, and we'll do that. We'll write a test for that later after we get these tests to work. But as you can see, we were able to write 4 tests that describe 99% of our functionality, and we're able to do so using 2 methods, basically, on our configuration store. We have our merge JSON method, and then we have our indexer. And I think that API is going to be exactly what we need for putting this together. So let's go ahead and exit full screen, and let's go ahead and write this class. At least stub it out so our tests can actually run. So let's open up the BuzzMMO base project, and let's make sure that JSON.NET is being referenced, which it isn't right now. So we'll definitely need to come up here to references on our base project and say manage NuGet packages. We'll definitely need to bring in JSON.NET right here. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can see Newtonsoft JSON right there. So now we can open up our infrastructure namespace and create our configuration store class. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go full screen, and I'm going to move the tests off to the side so I can see both files at the same time. In addition, on my tests, I will go ahead and import BuzzMMO base infrastructure at the top so that we can watch these errors disappear as we start writing our API. Okay, so let's start with public API. The first thing I'm pretty sure we're going to need is a constructor. So let's create a parameterless constructor, because I'm pretty sure we're going to have to put something in there. Next up, we need a merge JSON method. So I'm going to say public void merge JSON string. And then the next thing we're going to need is we're going to need this indexer. Now, indexers are actually properties, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to write this as a property, and I like putting my properties above my constructor. So the signature is going to look like public JObject, which will import Newtonsoft link JSON JObject up here at the top. And we're going to say this, and then string key, and then we're going to write a getter, and the getter is just going to return null right now so that our code compiles. Obviously, we'll put something a little bit more substantial in there momentarily. Okay, so now we have this, now we need to import the Fluent Assertions library now that this code compiles. So let's go ahead and do that. So by doing that, I have now imported Fluent Assertions at the top of the file. And that's it. Now you see all of our test code compiles. Make sure that it compiles. Obviously, it's not going to run because our configuration store hasn't, well, we haven't told it to do anything yet, but we'll just keep it like that. Okay, so now we have to actually implement our merge.json method. So the way I'm thinking that this code is going to work, and again, I don't actually know if the first road I go down is going to work, because I very rarely do a lot with JObjects, but directly. But the way I'm thinking it's going to work is what we'll need is a JObject that is at the topmost JObject, basically. And I'm going to represent that as a private JObject, or a private read-only JObject root object. And it's just going to be a root object as a private field of the configuration store. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate it in the constructor. So I'm just going to instantiate it as a JObject. I'm just doing something right here. What is a write to? Wait a sec. Are these even mutable? We can add stuff. Wonder if value JToken. Wonder if. Okay, we can replace. Okay, yeah, I think this will work. We'll see. We'll be going on an adventure here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here with the configuration store is the first thing I'm going to do is implement the accessor, because the accessor is pretty straightforward. We're just going to say root object. I'm just going to say root object at key value JObject. I actually don't know if this is going to work. But again, adventure time. So this is what the first thing I'm going to try right here. Once we actually implement merge.json, we'll have a lot more flexibility and we'll be able to pop open a debugger and see what's exactly is going on here. So merge.json, the first thing we need to do is actually parse the JSON string. So I'm going to say var parsed JSON equals JSON convert, which will import newtonsoft.json, dot deserialize object as a JObject, passing in JSON string. I'm not sure if deserialize object will actually throw an exception if the JSON string we passed in was a string or an array or an int, and we'll find that out. We can find that out later as a test. Either way, if it does throw an exception, that's a good thing, because I consider merge.json to be only willing to accept a JSON object. In fact, I really consider that so much that I think I'll change the name of merge.json. I'm going to call this merge.json object, and we're going to change the parameter to JSON object string to make it very clear that this method should only accept an actual object. Of course, by changing these names, if you do not have ReSharper, make sure to go ahead and change them in your tests as well. But it'll be a whole lot easier to change it now before we've written a bunch of code. Okay, so now we have our parse JSON. So what I need to do is I need to loop through, I kind of need to recursively loop through all the objects in parse JSON until we find a value or an object that doesn't exist, and then we need to merge them. So this will be kind of interesting. All right, so let's think here. Basically, the algorithm that we need to put together is, let's go ahead and just look at the tests here for a second and get an idea of what exactly needs to happen. So we have this root object in our configuration store, and we need to merge data into it. And this code needs to work, A, for merging the base data, basically the base data, and B, for merging new data that overlays on the base data. So we have to start thinking about what individual cases that we have to worry about. So for example, the first case is, well, basically the first thing is we need to write a recursive function. Obviously, we do. We need to write, because this is a tree structure, and we need to basically go through that tree and walk the tree and kind of line things up as we're walking the tree. So we need to walk the tree of the existing root object in our configuration store that we instantiated here and is effectively empty. And then we need to simultaneously walk the tree of what we pass into the merge JSON object. And we're going to run into a couple of cases. The first case is we're going to find a value that doesn't exist in the object that we're traversing that we already have. In that case, we need to insert that value. The next case is we'll find a value or a value. Sorry about that. Make sure to fix your spelling on that can merge JSON object. It's value one, not value one. The next case we need to traverse it, and if we find, in this case, what we're going to have is we're going to have a conflict because we're going to be traversing this object, and we're going to find this object has a property. This object right here has a property that already exists on this object, and this is going to have two cases. The first case is a simple replacement, as you see right here. We'll simply replace the value 2 in the original object with the value 2 that we just received. The final case is when we have a object and we have a match, right? Like what we have right here. So we're traversing the root object. We find we have an object 1 in our existing object store. And then we find that the thing we're merging also has an object 1. And at that point, we need to recurse into these two objects and then basically do what we just would have done before. There's one error case I actually just realized. There's an error case that I want to actually write a test for. And that is going to be public void cannot merge simple value into object. So what do I mean by that? Let's go ahead. I'll show you guys exactly what I'm referring to with this. Let's say we have configuration store and we want to merge JSON object and we want to pass in object1 and we pass in object1 with a ble of 1, 2, 3, right? Now let's say we get a configuration override that has an object1 but it replaces it with a simple value. Well, what should happen in this particular case? What I'm thinking should happen is it should throw an error, because I think this would break the idea of the configuration being a common structure that is understood by the code. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say action, which will import system, by the way, at the top of the file, system.action, and I'll say toFail equals lambda, and I'll say toFail should throw exception. And I'm not going to care about the details of what kind of exception it'll throw. So what I'm saying here is if we try to merge in an object with a simple value overlaying an existing object, we should throw an exception. Okay, so we've kind of got an idea of how the algorithm should work. We already know we need a recursive function, and we know we need to pass in two JObjects. So let's go ahead and write the signature of that recursive function first. I'm going to say private void merge JSON object. I'll just create an overload. It'll take in the JSON object. The first one is the merge into, and then we'll also have another JObject, and it'll be called merge from. So maybe this method will become a little bit more clear once I show you guys a use case of it. So inside of the merge JSON object, I'm going to invoke merge JSON object, and I'm going to pass in root object as the merge into, and parse JSON as the merged from. So now you see that we're going to be running this function, and we're always going to be kind of traversing both hierarchies in sync with each other. So the merge JSON object really just needs to loop over all of the values inside of each object, or inside of the merged from object is basically what we need to do. So I'm going to say for each var merge from object, or merged from token. I'm going to call them tokens because it might be an object, it might be a scalar. In merged from. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var existing object equals merge into at merge from token dot key. Now when we loop over a JObject, the key is the string name of the property. So for example, value1. And then the value is a J object that represents the value of that property. Okay, so what are our 3 cases? Well, we actually have 4 cases, but what is our first case? Our first case is that the existing object doesn't exist. So I'm going to say if existing object is null, this makes things really simple, because I can simply say merge into dot add, passing in a property name, which is merge from token, dot key, and then merge from token dot value. So this happens when the object doesn't exist in our existing object. Like, for example, what we have right here. Our first merge JSON object, our basic test right here, the first time this is ran, our root object is going to be empty. So when it tries to match the value 1 to a property in root object, it's going to find that it doesn't exist in the root object. So then it's just going to add this property right into our root object. In fact, since this test, that's the only case that we care about, all I have to do here is say run test run, and it should succeed. So I'm running the test, and Visual Studio is freezing, and it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the error I'm getting. It says invalid cast from system string to link JObject, and it's pointing to my indexer. Oh. Well, that's stupid of me. Why did I do that? Yeah, never mind. The indexer should not return a JObject. It should return a JToken. And that means I no longer have to do this dot value right here. It's the dot value that's throwing it off. That is my fault. In Newtonsoft.json or JSON.net, the base root object for a JSON value is JToken. And JObject is a child of that class. And JObjects are only going to be able to be castable into if the thing that we're trying to retrieve is a fully fledged object and not a scalar value. So let's go ahead and remove that .to value and make sure we change the signature to return a JToken. All right, let's go ahead and run our tests. Success. Let's go ahead and run all our tests because I'm hoping that we get 2 failures here. Well, we get 3 failures. Oh yeah, because we don't have the thing throwing an exception. But so now we see that these 2 guys, the can parse and extract JSON object and the can parse and extract JSON data, they both work because they're not merging any data. They're just adding new data to our root object. And that's exactly what we want right there. So we've successfully handled case 1 of our merging. So let's work on case 2 and 3. And that is basically what's going to happen is if the thing we're merging from is a JObject, then we have a choice to make. So I'm going to say else if merge from token dot value dot type equals JToken type dot object. That means we're merging in an object, not a scalar value. So this has 2 cases to it. A, are we trying to merge an object with an object? What do I mean by that? Well, if I come down here to can merge JSON object, notice how the root object is, the base object is going to have this obj1 property, which is a JObject, and the thing we're merging from is also has a obj1, which is an object. What do we do in that case when both of them are objects? Well, that's when we recurse and do this whole method over again, but pointing to each respective obj1 instead of the root. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a test case in here, or another if statement in here. I'm going to say if existing object dot type equals object, then what do? We merge JSON object. We just recurse down. And what we can do here is remember that existing object is a JToken, and so is merge from token. So we have to cast it into a JObject. But this cast is safe because we have already tested right here that this JToken is an object. So I'm going to say merge JSON object. For the merge into, I'm going to pass in existing object. And from the merge from, I'm going to pass in merge from token dot value. And so you guys can see that right there. So all we do is we simply recurse into the merge JSON object, but now we're walking down the tree. You can kind of think of us going a depth first search into the tree. But we have another case, and this case is our invalid operation exception. So what is this case so basically when we hit this if statement, we know existing object is not null, and we know that the thing we're merging is an object. Then we check to see if the existing object is an object, and if it is, we recurse. But if we hit this else statement, that means that the existing object is not an object, but we're trying to merge it with an object. And we've already decided, or at least I've already decided, that I want this to throw an error. I want this to be an early warning to whoever's using this configuration framework to say, well, you're trying to do something dumb, is basically what I'm wanting to do. So let's go ahead and write an error message that I think would be appropriate here. I'm going to say string.format, and then I'm going to say cannot merge scalar property, or cannot merge object property blank, or scalar, there we go, scalar property blank. And then I'll do another blank here for the value into an existing object. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to go full screen on this file here so you guys can see this. And I'll break this out, throw new exception into new lines for readability. What goes into the first blank? The first blank is going to be the token name. So I'm going to say merge from token.key, which is the property name. And then I'm going to pass in the merge from token, or hold on, am I doing this right? I'm even confusing myself right now. What are we doing? The existing object, the existing thing is an object, but the thing that we're merging is not an object. This won't be caught here. This is the I'm doing the other way around, aren't I? I'm checking to see if the thing that we're merging into is an object, but the thing that we're merging from is an object, but the thing that we're merging into is not an object. So the error message should be cannot merge property blank, then the value into a, or cannot merge object property, no, scalar property, no, object property into a scalar blank. And then the scalar is going to be the existing object. And then I'm just going to leave it to the toString implementation of this. Okay, that means this case has not been tested for yet. So we need to write a new test case to test this. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say test public void cannot merge object into simple value. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's write a unit tests are worth a million words, or whatever expression that is. Okay, so the idea here is that the base value, so value 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, but then I try to do something like this, configuration store dot merge JSON object, passing in value 1, and then passing in a new object with bleh equals 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so this should be illegal as well. So I'm going to say toFail should throw exception. So what I'm doing here is if we try to merge an object into a scalar value, it should also throw an exception. Because remember, we don't want to be able to change the types of these values. That's important because the code is going to rely on these configuration options being of particular kinds of data. And we don't want the overrides to be allowed to change the type of data. Okay, let's run this test, make sure it works, because that'll test this code right here. And as you see, it succeeded. So this exception was thrown. But that means we have another test case we have to handle, because this will still fail. If I run this, Yeah, it says expected an exception to be thrown, but no exception was thrown. So let's go ahead and fix this one. So this is the opposite of this exception. This happens when the existing type is an object, but our new type is not an object. So then I'm going to say else if existing object dot type equals object. This we can just throw an exception. So I'm just going to say throw new invalid operation exception. Cannot merge scalar property blank blank into object. I need to wrap this with a string format, of course. First merge from token key, and then we also pass in merge from token value. So this exception gets thrown when we try to merge an object or a scalar into an object. So let's just go ahead and run all our tests and see what we have left. Sweet. So we got success on everything except for can merge JSON object and can merge nested JSON object. And that's because we haven't handled the case of replacing data. Okay, so again, we have these major test cases here. We have if the object doesn't exist on the source, add it. If the token does exist and we're merging an object, merge it. Otherwise, if both existing object and merge from object are not objects, they're tokens, or sorry, they're scalar values, then we just replace the scalar value of the original. And that's going to happen when any of these conditions aren't true. So I'm just going to leave this off as an else. In this case, what I'm going to say is I'm going to say existing object dot replace with merge from token dot value. Okay, I'm thinking this method is suffering from readability issues. So let's go ahead and well, first let's run our tests and see what happens. Okay, all our tests pass. We can now merge configuration values, and that's super cool. But let's go ahead and increase the readability of this. I don't like mixing single, and I really need to fix that. I don't like mixing if statements that have blocks with if statements that don't have blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and just blockify all these if statements. I rarely do this, but in this particular example, I think an additional amount of vertical white space will make this code a little bit more readable. Next up, I'm going to clean up these exception throwing. I'm probably just going to move them all onto one line because, frankly, it's pretty ugly. Maybe bring the string.format there down a little bit. And then also, again, just for consistency and some additional vertical white space, I'll throw in some curlies right there. And then we're going to wait for a background operation to complete. I think that's the most important part. Okay, I think that increased the readability a little bit. I also don't like the fact that I called this existing object. I think that's misleading because it might be a scalar. We don't know if it's an object yet. So to match the verbiage that I used on the merge from token, I'm going to rename existing object to existing token. So I'm going to hit Control-RR and rename this existing token. And I think that name makes it a lot nicer right there. So, yeah. That's really it. It's a 59-line file. And we have our tests, and all our tests pass, which is really cool. Well, I just changed a bunch of stuff, although it was all cosmetic. Let's run these tests again just to be sure, and of course they all succeed. Okay, I want to go ahead and just introduce, I don't know, one more test just to go a little crazy. I always like doing a little bit of a crazy test, even though there's no reason why this should fail. And let's just call this public void third level nested object merges 3 times, I guess. I don't know, terrible name. But this isn't really an important test because this is just testing things that we've already tested. But I do like going a little bit crazy with this stuff. So merge JSON object will have a object with obj1, who will have obj2, or let's just say nested object merges 3 times, and then we'll have an obj3, and obj3 will have a value 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a value 2 of string value. And then let's also give obj2 a value 3 of 43.34. Then let's go ahead and let's replace that value 3. So to replace that value 3, we need to select obj1, then obj2, and then value 3, and replace it with 65.43. And then let's also try to replace that value 1. So let's do obj1, obj2, obj3, and it has a value 2 of hey there. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab obj1, obj2, obj3 value int should be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then configuration store obj1, obj2, obj3 dot value of string should be, or whoops, we're doing obj3 and then we're doing value 1 dot value, and then we're doing obj3 value 2. Now value 2 should be hey there. And then finally we need to grab obj1 dot obj2 obj2 value 3 value of a float should be 65.43f. Alright, no reason why this should fail. And of course it does. Unexpected character encountered. Oh, my hand wrote JSON seems to be off a little bit. What's going on here? obj3, I forgot curlies. And success. That all works. I want to try one more thing. Just one more thing here, just to maybe clean some things up a little bit. I want to see can access nested property with dot notation. I want to see if this even works by default, and if it doesn't work, I kind of want to build it in. Configuration store equals new configuration store dot merge JSON object. I'm just going to steal this whole thing right here because I'm lazy. Then I'm going to say configuration store at obj1 dot obj2 dot obj3 dot value 2 dot value string should be string value. I'm not even sure if this will work, and if it doesn't, I kind of want to build it in because that'll make things a lot nicer. Null reference exception. It really didn't like that. Let me make sure that I... Okay, I did. Let's go ahead and build this in, the ability to do a dot notation, because I think that'll make things a lot easier when doing this. So, what I'm going to do here is on the index, on the accessor, what I'm going to say is I'm going to say return key.index of dot equals -1 question mark root object key. Otherwise, I'm going to say colon. What would be the easiest way to do this? Let's just pass in the result of a method. So I'm going to say traverse or parse dot notation, and I'm going to pass in key. So the parse dot notation method. So basically, if the key has a dot within it, which wait a sec, well, Well, that's fine. Technically, I do believe you can include dots in JSON property names. Actually, I don't want to remove that capability. Honestly, that's a bad idea. Bad idea. We're just going to, Oh, come on. Don't tell me I undid the renaming of... Hold on. There we go. I'm not going to worry about this. This is fine. A little ugly syntax, but I don't want to remove the capability of putting a dot in the JSON file. So I'm just going to delete this test and keep it at that. But anyway, the point is we can now merge JSON files together and have overriding values be put into them, which is really cool, and it allows us to do a lot of interesting things. Or at least it allows us to write our configuration system. So I guess the next video we'll introduce the concept of files, and we'll write our build process and our Unity stuff, and then we'll pull out our URLs into these JSON files, and stuff will be super awesome. So we'll see you guys in the next video.